Welcome back. Today I'm going to analyze one of my longest daily games ever. I'm not sure if it's the longest, but not only in terms of moves, it was 107 moves long, but also in terms of time overall. The game began in December of 2021 and just ended today in April of 2022. So just over 4 months. But anyway, the first half of this game, this was one of the opponents that plays only when they have to in a daily game. They don't come back several times during the day and make another move. So this was a 3-day daily game, which meant that they only played it once every 3 days. I would move usually within a few hours of their move, and then they wouldn't play again for 3 days. And then the second half of the game, they played much more quickly, so I'm not sure what happened. Regardless, there's a few interesting points about this game, and one is the whole entire latter half, the endgame, which I almost put that into a separate video for studying endgame tactics, working on my weaknesses, but it makes more sense just to put it all together. We opened with the Caro-Kann, which is one of the openings I have been trying to study, but on move 2, my opponent played h3, which wasn't in any of the lines that I had studied in the Caro-Kann. Here, white almost always plays d4. Every now and then, I see a knight to f3 or a knight to c3. So when they played h3, I wasn't sure what to do. So we did okay up until, as you can see from the evaluation, it's pretty close. We're doing all right. I think it was here, where they made a backwards bishop move. That gave me an advantage, but I didn't know it at the time. I just knew that was kind of weird because just 2 moves earlier they had moved the bishop out, and now they've moved it back. But, obviously during the game, I don't know that I have a huge advantage. We played on. That turned out to not be that bad for me, and I did okay. I castled, and they castled, and we're sitting here. And again, I think during the game that this is about even, but this is one of the significant moments of the game, which is why I stopped here. Here, the engine's taken its time to make up its mind, but when I evaluated several times, these are the 3 moves that the engine is suggesting to me to keep my advantage. Now it's adding in bishop to d7 here. Okay, but I did something else, and I just wanted to kind of go through why, and maybe something will spark in me. I don't know. But I know that I wouldn't have considered queen to a5. I mean, now looking at this position, it's possible I might get this exact position some future game, and then I'll think, wait, the engine said queen to a5 is better. But I probably still won't move it because I don't know why it's better. It doesn't attack anything. This is well defended. This is well defended. It does pin the knight. But the knight, what was the knight going to do anyway? It wasn't coming here, was it? It certainly wasn't going there. So yeah, I don't know what the queen's going to do here. And even if someone said, oh, put queen on a5 during the game, which would be cheating. But if they said that, I would say, no, they're just going to play b5 or b4 and block it. That's what I would do if I was white. So why would I want my queen there? Because then they do that, and then I'm going to have to come back, right? Then they're going to put their knight here, and I'm going to have to come back even further. So wouldn't it make sense just to put my queen here where it is? The engine is also suggesting b5. I really don't know what that does as well. I mean, it does protect those 2 squares. I know that. But I didn't really think anything was going to go to one of those 2 squares right now. I mean, maybe the knight was thinking of coming here to try to sneak in somehow. But it already can't do that. Whoops, my queen's guarding. But anyway, I didn't see that, and now it's suggesting bishop to d7. That probably would have been okay. It helps connect my rooks and develops my final piece. And another evaluation said king to e8. I have been known occasionally when I'm not sure what to do just to move my king back and forth, but I don't think that's why the engine was suggesting king to h8. I suppose it was to get it off this diagonal, but that diagonal looks pretty strong to me, so I never would have thought of that. What I did was played e5, which turns out to be a pretty strong mistake or minor blunder, even though my thinking was, yes, they can take it two ways, but I also can take it two ways. And I'm still not sure that I understand why this is a blunder. And my opponent did capture. And I did capture back. And the reason I captured back with my bishop, which turns out to be the worst move, is because the bishop was blocking my queen from guarding this pawn. But now I'm in much worse shape. They took, I took. And then maybe this is why it ends up being a blunder, because I also lose this extra pawn. So now my opponent has taken my final center pawn, and I don't even have a c pawn because I lost that during the Caro-Kann exchange earlier. Maybe that's why e5 was a mistake. Regardless, I'm down significantly here due to that exchange because I played e5. All that started because I played e5 thinking that was a good idea. And now I've lost the last center pawn of the game, and my opponent has a huge advantage. And they kept that huge advantage all the way out to move 50. As you can see here by the engine, they're still, it's a much bigger advantage now. We have both played well. The game review said we both had, like, I don't know, 55 best moves or something. But we got here, and my opponent's advantage has increased. Now, I had set up what I thought was one of my last chances at counterplay. My opponent has two connected passed pawns with a rook shepherding them down. Yes, the rook would be better placed behind these passed pawns, but it's not doing too poorly here. It is keeping my g-pawn from coming to assist. And I don't know what else to do. But I had managed to sneak this knight in here, guarded by this pawn, with the intention of some sort of check here, because earlier when I set that up, that knight wasn't here. I don't remember exactly where it was, but I set this up thinking that I could check here and it would force the king back, and then I would work out something from there. But the knight is here now, so checking here wouldn't work. So what I came up with was checking on h1. And it turns out, if you look up here, that is the best move in this position. My idea was that once I check here, which I did, that the opponent has two choices, g1 or f1. Now, I thought if they went to f1, then I can't bring my rook, but I can bring the knight back and check. And the king's only got those two choices still, right? If the king goes to f1, I come back, and we're in the same position we were before. He would be in check. He'd have to come back here, and then I would go there again. Or we'd have to go to g1, and I could bring my rook. I was thinking of several different things here. I thought maybe I could get him to repeat moves, but I also knew that if he went to g1, I would check, force him back here, and you'll see what happened because he did go to g1. But the engine says if he goes to f1, white still has a huge advantage. I didn't follow that line out to find out why, but I'm just mentioning that to explain my plan. I miscalculated, I guess, and I thought if he went to g1, thought if he went to f1, that I could maybe get him to repeat moves. But my opponent went to g1, and it says I have mate in 10. I didn't know that. I honestly thought I had mate in fewer than 10, because I knew, bam, the only legal move, because the knight is guarded by the rook, and the knight guards this spot, and the rook cuts off those two spots. Only legal move, king has to go to h2, right? Isn't that awesome? And now, I thought, put the knight back where it was, guarded by this pawn. The king can't move at all. And there's nothing white can do to prevent me from playing that, which will be checkmate. But there turns out to be one thing that white can do, and they did it. They sacrificed their rook for that pawn. Now, the engine, Stockfish, knows that there's still a forced mate in 8. Well, I will probably never see a forced mate in 8 unless it's a simple ladder mate or something like that, or a pawn race to promotion. But here I went through a series of calculations that turned out to be incorrect. I calculated that if I took the rook, which seems like the most obvious best move here, they've just given up that rook for a pawn. I thought if I took the rook, they're going to put their knight here. and check me and give up their knight too. And I will take their knight, and then I will have both their pieces, and I will still have a knight and a rook. But then I've lost my checkmating sequence, because I thought that once that happened, the g-pawn would move forward. And I could take it back with the knight, still guarded by the pawn, but now the king has an escape route because the g-pawn is not in the way anymore. And so I thought my whole plan had fallen apart, and that even with my rook and a knight here, and that would be gone, the g-pawn would be gone, the knight would be gone, this rook would be gone, but they still have two passed pawns connected very close to promotion, and I thought at best it would be a draw, or maybe they would win. So I thought, what if I didn't take the rook? Brilliant plan, right? What if I don't take the rook? I still have mate in one waiting. But as it turns out, I should have taken the rook, because yes, they would have checked me on h5, and yes, I would have taken it, and yes, they would have moved their g-pawn. All that was how I calculated. But knight coming in here would have been a mistake in taking us back to drawn. I did not calculate, completely missed, that I could take with my h-pawn. H takes g3. It's protected by the knight, and it's check, leaving the king only one legal move, and then I check on e2. So the king has some choices, but none of them are good. And let's say they make the best one. Then put the knight here, which isn't check, but it guards that spot. The pawn guards this spot. The knight guards the rook. The king can't go anywhere, so let's say they do this. Then check. Knight's guarding both of these pieces. King has only one legal move, which is here. Then the knight's still guarding the pawn, so I check. It doesn't matter which way the king goes. I promote with the queen, and it's mate. But I didn't see all of that, because I didn't see that the pawn could take the g-pawn after that series of moves. So I did not take the rook. The arrow's already there from my previous evaluation, but I didn't see that. I thought they would try, some sort of shenanigans, like protecting the rook with the knight and then trying to figure out a checkmate, and then they would still blunder mate in one. But my opponent did see that I had mate in one, so they took that knight, which now they have a huge advantage because I didn't take that rook. And that huge advantage lasted for some time, but I'm kind of proud of this scenario right through here, where I systematically chopped off those passed pawns. And as they advanced, I made some of the best moves. And whoa, remember they had like a 93 plus advantage? Now they have a 5 plus advantage because some of their moves weren't the best. And some of mine were. That looked like it slowed down a little bit. Regardless, their advantage is now 1.6, and it's only if they play h6. But they didn't play h6. They moved the knight back. I think afraid that I'm going to get this pawn. And then if they moved, if they thought, I guess they thought if they moved h6, I was going to take this pawn, and then their knight would be unguarded. But I wouldn't have been able to catch the h-pawn, I think, at that point. Regardless, they didn't move the h-pawn. They did that, and now they don't have an advantage anymore. And I'm proud of this endgame. Not that I played it perfectly, but I think I played it pretty well, in that my king guards that spot, so their king has to go back, and now their king can't come forward again because my rook's cutting it off. Whoops, they went back. So I get between these two pawns. There's not much that they can do. I take that pawn. You see, black has a slight advantage now. Now my idea here was to continue cutting off this king, and if they tried to push the h-pawn, I would be able to catch it. And that's what happened. I was able to catch it, and now they only have one pawn left. I think my computer's running out of processing power. But I was very carefully able to get that last pawn. The hard part was keeping my rook and king just far enough apart or in the correct positions that the knight couldn't attack both of us at the same time. Because as long as white has that pawn, they have a chance that I don't have, because they can promote it. All I've got's the rook, and I don't have anything that can promote in place of it. Again, lots of playing around, and we're at move 81 now. I wanted, again, getting the rook out of the way so there's no chance of that knight being able to attack my king and my rook at the same time. Now they moved here, obviously, to protect this square. I can't now come up. I can't go here because of the pawn. So I make another rook move, cutting the king off from coming any closer. Now I'm next to that pawn. There's not much they can do. I get the pawn. Now, at this point, I didn't know this at the time. After the game, I looked this up. Rook and knight endgames, where it's a king and a rook versus a king and a knight, almost always end in a draw. And I didn't know that during the game. If I had known that, I think right here I would have offered my opponent a draw, or forced a draw. Because I know that they cannot, I did know that they can't checkmate me with a knight and a king. So, I thought, you know what, I could force a draw and just be done with this by just giving up my rook. Like if I put my rook right there and they took it, it would the game would have ended. Chess.com would have ended the game. It would have been a stalemate because they are a draw, because they do not have sufficient material. But the other option was to play out to the 50 move rule. And it was just a couple of moves ago, or last move, where I took their last pawn, which was the last capture and also prevents any future pawn moves. And the 50 move rule, in case you're not familiar, is that after the last capture or pawn move, you got 50 moves before it's an automatic stalemate, or at least on these websites. I believe on the board you have to claim the draw after 50 moves. But on chess.com it's automatic. I know, I've done it before in I think a blitz game. But I considered that, just ending it, give up my rook, and it's automatic draw. But now I decided, you know what, I'll just play to the 50 move rule. So we went on for a long time. Whoa, what happened? Did I miss something? Oh my goodness. Wait, I have a 9-point advantage? What should I have done? 23-point advantage. Oh my goodness. They made a mistake and gave me this. And I missed it. Oh. I didn't even see that during my initial evaluation. If I had gone to King E4, well, that prevents their knight from getting back closer to their king. And it can't check me at this point, but then what? It says their best move is to put their knight over here, and I still have a huge advantage at that point. Wow. I had no idea. But instead, wait, that is what I played? I did play E4, but I didn't know that I had this huge advantage, and now it says it's huge. And they didn't play one of their best moves? Oh my goodness, 55. This is frustrating to find this out right now. All I had to do was play rook to a6. I wouldn't have ever played rook to a6, just because it would be too easy for the knight to attack me either way. What would rook to a6 have done? Right? Wouldn't it have just gone to b4 or b8? Well, it says it doesn't. It says if they do anything but knight to e7, I have a mate. Where's knight? It says if they go there, it prevents mate. Nope, it found mate. Oh my goodness. And then all I would have... Because I get the knight so far away that it can't do anything. Oh, wow. because it can't come up here because of my king, and now it can't go here because of my rook. And so basically it would have to go to c8 or g8, and either way I would be able to force a mate. I did not know that. Okay, so I did play the right move here when it gave me the advantage. I just didn't realize that. I was trying to get to push their king back, but I thought if I went there, they're just going to check me again. So that must have been why I went there. But then they played that, and I did not, and probably would not see rook to a6 at this point, or even rook to b3. It says that's a long mating sequence. Yes, thank you, Stockfish, for seeing mate in 51, but I didn't see that. So now that this is out of checking distance, I went here thinking I could push their king back, and apparently that lost all my advantage. But anyway, as I said earlier, I found out that knight versus rook endgames are almost always a draw with careful play. And for a long time here, other than the little scenario that you just saw, I think we both played very carefully. I kept my rook either far away and out of danger because it's a long-range piece, can go wherever it wants, or kept it close enough where my king could protect it. My opponent kept trying to check me, and I kept moving into a spot where they couldn't fork my two remaining pieces. Then I would offer a check, trying to force my opponent to move one way or the other, and trying to trap them in a corner or something. And what here it says, I just have a little bit of a slight advantage there. Again, if I would have played rook b8. Well, I didn't. I played that. Okay. And here I did play rook c8 because I've got the opposition, so I'm forcing their king back. And my idea was, again, just to force the king up against a side someplace. But then it's got that knight that can hop out. And so I have to come in to protect my rook. They can challenge my rook, so I run away. Now, right about... You see that we're already at move 105. Okay, so... I did make my best move here. The idea was to come here and then see what they would do. Hopefully they would make a mistake and lose their knight. Well, they didn't. They challenged my rook. Well, I came here to where they could protect, because the knight can't get to a place from there where they could fork my two pieces. But they did that on move 107. And instead of making it to the 50 move rule, which I think would have been move 134, I was flabbergasted, and so I took their knight and they resigned. So apparently they just had, after all that really careful play, they just had a blind spot right here. And instead of playing knight to b4 check, yeah, instead of playing that or something, they did that, gave up the knight, and then they resigned. So I won this incredibly lengthy game, which taught me a few things. And like I said, just to repeat, one is that knight and rook end games almost always end in a draw with careful play. As you saw during the evaluation, my opponent had made a mistake and gave me a huge advantage, but taking advantage of that advantage is something that I won't see for some time. And you also saw that in a little innocent move like e5, just back there on move 10 or 11, whatever it was, completely changed the course of the game and gave my opponent a huge advantage. But thank you for sticking with me, and I do think that I learned some things from this game. If nothing else, I learned about rook and knight endgames. We'll see you next time.